The flowers were gardenias, too many of them, arranged in tight white clusters along every surface of the chapel, and the smell was so thick I had to breathe through my mouth just to keep moving. I wasn't supposed to be there. I mean, technically I was. I had a printed invitation, my name spelled correctly, and everything, slipped under my apartment door 3 days after my patient died. But standing in the doorway of St. Augustine's, watching men in dark suits move through the pews like chess pieces, I understood that the invitation was not a kindness. It was a message. Someone wanted to see what I would do. I was a hospice nurse. I'd spent 6 years learning how to be invisible in rooms full of grief. You move quietly, you speak softly, and you never make it about yourself. You are the person who checks the IV line while a family holds their last conversation. You are the person who writes the time in a small box on a form, and then you go home and you make dinner, and you try not to carry it with you. But I'd never had a patient like him. His name was Franklin Marsh. 71 years old, admitted to Cornerstone Hospice care outside of Cincinnati on a Thursday afternoon in early March. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, maybe 8 weeks left. That was the official estimate. His file was thin for a man who'd lived that long. No emergency contacts listed. No next of kin. His intake form had a line for occupation, and he'd written, in a careful, deliberate hand, "Retired business consultant." The first thing he said to me when I walked into his room was, "You have the eyes of someone who doesn't scare easily." "Good morning to you too," I said, and I checked his chart. He laughed. A real laugh. Not the polite kind sick people sometimes produce when they're trying to seem fine. "I'm going to like you," he said. "Sit down." "I don't sit down with patients on the first visit." "You will with me." He was right. Within a week, I was pulling the chair up to his bed every morning before my other rounds. He talked, and I listened, and somewhere in between, taking his blood pressure and adjusting his pain medications, I started to understand that Franklin Marsh was not a retired business consultant. He never said it directly. That wasn't his way. But there were things. The way his visitors sat with their backs to the wall, always facing the door. The way a conversation would stop completely the moment I entered the room, picked back up only after I'd been gone long enough. The man who came every Tuesday and referred to himself only as his associate. The way Franklin watched all of it from his bed with eyes that were still sharp, still calculating, even as the rest of him got smaller. "You're curious," he said to me one afternoon. "I'm a nurse. It's an occupational hazard. You're curious about me specifically." I straightened his blanket. "My job is to make you comfortable, that's it." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You're a terrible liar." The truth was, I'd done a search on his name 3 days after he was admitted. I didn't find much. A few real estate holdings in Kentucky, a mention in a Cincinnati business journal from 2009, a photograph from a charity gala, where he stood slightly apart from the group, not quite smiling. But I'd spoken to enough people in enough difficult circumstances to know what it looked like when a man had spent his whole life making sure there wasn't much to find. I didn't care, is the thing. Not about what he'd done, or what he was. I cared that he was in pain, and that he was alone in a way that had nothing to do with the number of visitors. "Do you have children?" I asked him once. "A daughter." He said it carefully. "We are not close, that's a shame. It is what it is. Does she know you're here?" He looked at the window. It was raining, the kind of flat gray Ohio rain that makes everything look temporary. "She knows." I didn't push, that wasn't my job. But I thought about that daughter for a long time afterward. I thought about what it meant to know your father was dying, and to stay away anyway. And whether that was cruelty or self-preservation or something in between, that didn't have a clean name. He lasted 11 weeks instead of 8. I think he did it out of stubbornness. The man had a will that was almost physical. You could feel it in the room, the way he refused to let his body have the last word. But in the end, the body always wins. He died on a Tuesday, early morning, before his associate's usual visit. I was there. He'd been unconscious for most of the previous day, but in those last hours he surfaced briefly, the way people sometimes do. He opened his eyes and looked at me, and there was something clear in his face, something that had been buried under all those weeks of careful distance. "You were good to me," he said. His voice was barely there. "You made it easy." "No," a small, tired smile. I didn't. He was gone 20 minutes later. I wrote the time in the small box on the form. I sat with him for a few minutes, the way I always did, the way no one else would know to do because no one else was there. Then I went, and I made my other rounds, and I tried not to carry it with me. The invitation appeared under my door that Friday. I wore my good black dress to the funeral, the one I'd bought for my grandmother's service 7 years ago, and had worn exactly twice since. I told myself I was going, because it was the right thing to do, the respectful thing. I told myself that all the way to the parking lot of St. Augustine's. Standing in that doorway, surrounded by gardenias and men with careful posture, I admitted to myself that I was there, because Franklin Marsh had said she knows in a voice that held a whole story I'd never heard, and I wanted to see the ending. I found a seat near the back. The chapel was maybe a third full. Not a small crowd for a man with no family listed, but not the kind of turnout you'd expect if you'd actually known who he was. Everyone was well dressed. No one looked like they'd been crying. The service was brief. A priest who seemed unfamiliar with the deceased. A single piece of music played through speakers that were too loud for the space. I watched the door. She came in during the second hymn. She was younger than I'd imagined. Late 30s, maybe 40. Wearing a black coat that was too warm for April and moving through the chapel, with the particular tension of someone who had argued with herself all the way here and still wasn't sure she'd made the right choice. She slid into a pew across the aisle from me and kept her eyes forward. She didn't look like Franklin, not at first. But then she turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see her profile, and there it was. The same set to the jaw, the same quality of watching without appearing to watch. I should have left it alone. I'm a hospice nurse. I know grief. I know the way it moves through people differently. Some loud and some silent and some arriving late, weeks after the fact, catching you in a grocery store or in the car at a red light. I know that whatever she was carrying in that chapel was not my business. But when the service ended and people began moving toward the casket for a final viewing, I watched her stand at the back of the line, and I watched her face cycle through something complicated and private, and I made a decision. I walked over. I was his nurse, I said quietly. At Cornerstone, I was with him when he died. She looked at me the way people look at strangers who approach them at funerals, a careful, neutral assessment. I know who you are, she said. He mentioned you. That surprised me. He talked about me? He said you were the most stubborn woman he'd ever met. A pause. From him, that was a significant compliment. Something loosened in my chest that I hadn't realized was tight. I said, he talked about you too. Her expression shifted, just slightly, just enough. Did he? He was proud of you. He didn't say it like that. He wasn't the kind of man who said things like that directly. But it was in everything else he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Around us, people moved and murmured, and the gardenias kept doing their work. Too sweet, too much. He made a lot of choices, she said finally. That affected a lot of people. I know. You probably don't. Not really. She said it without cruelty. Just fact. But I believe you that he was. That at the end he was. She stopped, pressed her lips together. Thank you for being there. It was an honor. I mean that. She looked at me for a moment, and then something in her expression changed, shifted, opened slightly, like a window that had been painted shut, finally giving way. We ended up standing there for almost an hour. After the formal service dispersed, and the men in dark suits had filed out, and even the priest collected his things, and gone, we stood near the back of the chapel among the fading gardenias, and she talked about her father. Not the parts I'd read about in a vague Cincinnati business journal. The other parts. The birthday she'd waited for him at a restaurant and he hadn't come. And then 3 days later a package had arrived with no card. Just an expensive bracelet she'd never worn. The graduation where he stood in the back because, he'd explained, it wasn't safe to be closer. The phone calls she'd stopped returning at 26 because continuing felt like choosing to drown slowly. I used to think it was a choice, she said. His life. Like he'd picked it over us deliberately. What do you think now? She considered. I think he was in it before he understood what it was. And then he didn't know how to get out. And then he stopped trying. She paused. I don't know if that's better or worse. Maybe it's just true, I said. Maybe it doesn't have to be better or worse. She looked at me. her father's eyes sharp and measuring. He was right about you. Her name was Adelaide. She'd lived in Columbus for 12 years, working as an urban planner, which her father had apparently found both baffling and quietly impressive. She had a dog named something unpronounceable that she'd adopted from a rescue. She'd driven 2.5 hours to this chapel, and wasn't sure until she was walking through the door whether she was going to go in. She'd gone in. We exchanged numbers in the parking lot, the way people sometimes do at funerals, and you're not entirely sure afterward whether it means something or whether it was just the gravity of the moment pressing you together temporarily. This one meant something. She called me 2 weeks later. I was finishing a night shift, still in my scrubs, sitting in my car in the Cornerstone parking lot eating a gas station sandwich because I hadn't had time for a real meal since 6 that morning. I found some things, she said, going through his house. I don't know what to do with them. What kind of things? Letters. Some are addressed to me. Some are addressed to my mother. She's been gone for 9 years. A pause. Some are addressed to people I don't know. I thought about Franklin Marsh's careful handwriting on his intake form. Retired business consultant. Do you want company? I asked. A brief silence, the kind where someone is deciding how much they need something versus how much they want to appear not to need it. I'm in Cincinnati for the weekend. Going through the house. Another pause. I could make dinner. I said yes. His house was in a quiet neighborhood in Hyde Park. Brick, older, with mature trees in the front yard, and a garden that had been tended with real care. Nothing about it announced itself. It looked like a house where someone's grandfather had lived quietly for a long time, which I suppose was exactly the point. Adelaide met me at the door in jeans and one of those oversized flannels that suggest a person has been doing physical work and thinking about hard things simultaneously. She'd made chicken marsala, proper marsala, with the wine and the mushrooms, not the shortcut version, and we ate it at her father's kitchen table surrounded by boxes. I keep finding things that don't match, she said. Like there are 2 houses here, the one on the surface, everything ordinary and a little old-fashioned, and then underneath that, things I don't have a context for. What kind of things? Passports. 4 of them, all expired, all with different names. She said it the way you say something you've been trying to make sense of for 2 weeks and still can't. Cash, in a lockbox in the basement. I counted it. $43,000. She set her fork down. Letters from people thanking him for things that, are described in the vaguest possible way, your assistance with the matter. What you did for my family, that kind of thing. I thought about the men who sat with their backs to the wall. About associate, said carefully, meaning something that colleague didn't cover. Did you know? I asked. Before, I knew something. I didn't know specifics. She looked at her hands. My mother knew more than she ever told me. I think she decided that not knowing was how. She got to keep the version of him that she loved. Is that why you left? I left because I was 26, and I was starting to make the same calculations she made, and I knew if I kept making them, I was going to end up in the same place. She looked up. I wasn't wrong to leave. No, I said. I don't think you were. But I've spent 14 years being so certain I was right that I didn't let it be complicated. She gestured at the boxes, the house, the whole accumulated weight of a life she'd been trying not to think about. And now I'm sitting here, and it's complicated. I stayed until midnight. We went through 2 of the boxes together, and I listened while she narrated what she found, and I didn't offer interpretations or judgments because that wasn't what she needed. What she needed was someone who could sit with the complexity without flinching, without trying to resolve it prematurely into something clean. That, at least, I knew how to do. The letters were the thing. There were 41 of them addressed to Adelaide, spanning almost a decade and a half. He'd never sent a single one. They were in a file folder in the bottom drawer of his desk, in chronological order, each one dated, each one in his careful, deliberate hand on heavy cream paper. She called me when she found them. It was a Sunday morning. I was making coffee, and she said, "I need you to come back," and I got in my car. We sat at that kitchen table, and she read them to me, one by one, and I understood then what 11 weeks in a hospice room had only let me partially see. Franklin Marsh had been underneath everything, A man who had understood what he'd cost the people he loved and had never figured out how to say it to their faces. The letters were what happened when the cost finally outweighed the pride. He wrote about her mother's laugh. He wrote about the specific color of the kitchen they'd had when Adelaide was small yellow, not quite gold. He wrote about the graduation he'd attended from the back of the room, and how he'd stood there, watching her cross the stage, and understood that he had made, at some point, a choice that had led to this distance, and that the choice had mattered, and that he was sorry. He used that word clearly, directly, without qualification. I am sorry. Not I did what I had to do. Not it was complicated. Just, I am sorry. And I have not known how to say it where you could hear it. Adelaide made it through about half of them before she stopped being able to read out loud. I took the folder gently and finished reading them to her. And when I got to the last one, dated 8 months ago, before he'd known he was sick, I understood that the invitation under my door had been arranged well in advance. That he had wanted someone at his funeral, who knew both sides of the ledger, not to defend him, just to be able to say he talked about you and mean it, and have that mean something to the daughter who'd driven 2.5 hours and almost turned back at the door. I set the folder down. He did love you, I said. That part was real. I know. Her voice was steady in the way that voices get when someone has moved through the worst of it to the other side. I know it was real. I'm not sure that makes everything else less true. No, I said, it doesn't. Both things can be true at the same time. She was quiet. Afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window, the kind of soft spring light that makes everything look like it might be okay eventually. I used to think forgiving someone meant deciding they were right, she said. It doesn't. I know that now. I think I knew it before. I just didn't want to practice it. She looked at the stack of letters. I don't know what I'm going to do with all of this. The house, the money, the everything he was that I didn't know about. You don't have to decide today. No. A small exhale. I don't. She called an attorney. A good one, someone who specialized in estate situations that were, as the attorney put it diplomatically, multifaceted. The $43,000 turned out to be the smallest of it. There were accounts, properties, arrangements that had been set up carefully over a long time by a man who had known, on some level, that this reckoning would eventually come. He'd tried to make it as clean as possible. It wasn't entirely clean, but it was cleaner than it could have been. Adelaide sold the house in Hyde Park. She kept the garden tools, a good set of Japanese pruning shears, a trowel with a worn wooden handle, things that had been used and cared for. She kept the file folder with the letters. She kept a photograph she found tucked in the back of his closet. The three of them together. Her parents and her, at maybe 4 years old, all of them squinting into the sun somewhere warm, her mother laughing at something just outside the frame. He kept it, she said, showing it to me. All this time. Of course he did. The cash, after consulting with the attorney, was donated, split between a hospice care foundation and a community center in the neighborhood where he'd grown up, a detail she'd found in one of the letters. A neighborhood in eastern Cincinnati that had shaped him long before any of the other shaping had happened. It wasn't a clean ending. Real things rarely are. But it was honest, and I think honesty was what both of them had been working toward in their different imperfect ways for a very long time. I think about Franklin Marsh on Tuesdays. I don't know why Tuesdays specifically. Maybe, because that's when his associate used to come. And I always knew those were the days that cost him something. I think about what it means to spend a lifetime building walls and then, at the end, sit with a nurse you've known for 11 weeks and say you were good to me as if that's the thing that needed to be witnessed. I think about Adelaide, who drove 2.5 hours and almost turned back and didn't. I became a hospice nurse because I believed that how a person dies matters. That the people who come at the end, who check the lines, who sit in the chair, who write the time in the small box. Those people matter too, even if no one remembers their names. I still believe that. Franklin Marsh remembered mine. A few months after the funeral, Adelaide drove up to Cincinnati to see a friend, and she stopped by Cornerstone on her way back through. She wasn't a patient's family member anymore, so technically there was no reason for her to be there. And I told her that, and she said her father had been right. I was stubborn. And she'd brought me a plant for my office. It was a gardenia. I almost laughed. I almost said something about the chapel, about the smell, about too many flowers arranged in too tight clusters. Instead, I set it on my windowsill, where the morning light hits it first. It blooms every spring. I've kept it alive 4 years now, which is longer than anyone told me. Gardenias typically last in Ohio. I think it stays out of stubbornness, mostly. That, at least, makes sense to me.